Hello again. I will readily admit, before going any further, that I'm not really a fan of our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. I think that he is dishonest, vain, unreliable, shifty, evasive, and incompetent. Lovely fellow, of course, but not perhaps the best man to have in charge of the country at such a precarious time in world affairs. The United States have been bombing Yemen, the Russians have been bombing Kiev, the Israelis have been bombing Gaza, and there are rumours that America and Israel are preparing to bomb Iran. Why, at such a juncture, should Britain be getting ready to put its soldiers in harm's way by sending them off to play piggy in the middle between the Russians and Ukrainians? Let's be brutally honest. Even if Vladimir Putin is a bloodthirsty warmonger with territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe, there is not the slightest chance of his attacking, much less invading, this country. Encroaching on Lithuanian land? Possibly. Or menacing Poland or Moldova? Perhaps. But he really isn't going to come here, is he? So what on earth are the British up to? It all looks really mystifying. A lot of people just do not seem to understand what our interest in Ukraine is, or perhaps they're deceived into thinking that it's some altruistic enterprise on our part, that we're really concerned about the plucky little David standing up to the mighty Russian Goliath. It's nothing of the sort. The problem is that few people realise that one of the best reasons for studying history is so that we are better able to understand the present. Once you understand that simple proposition, everything falls neatly into place. What are we up to in Ukraine? Exactly the same as we were up to when last we had troops there during the Crimean War in the 1850s. And much the same game that we were playing in the Dardanelles and on the beaches of Gallipoli in 1915. Remember when we tried to seize the Dardanelles during the First World War? It was for much the same reason that we are now planning for boots on the ground in Ukraine. It is a simple matter of geopolitics. Stand by for a brief lesson in geopolitical theory. The United States is, as Britain once was, a sea power. This means that America can project its military forces anywhere in the world by sending an aircraft carrier wherever it's needed. The Americans have open access to the high seas. They can send a ship from one of their ports anywhere they please. Russia is, by way of contrast, a land power. It is very big and almost impossible to seize by land forces. Montgomery's first rule of warfare was "Don't march on Moscow." One remembers both Napoleon and Hitler coming a cropper by doing so. That's great for defence, but when it comes to projecting its power around the world, as the Americans do so regularly, Russia runs into difficulties. This is because its access to the high seas is strictly limited. It's partly because most of its ports, places like Archangel and Murmansk, are iced up for half the year. The lack of warm water ports has curbed Russia's imperial ambitions for the last few centuries. Russia's ports, you see, even when free of ice, do not give access to the open sea, but only to very limited areas which are enclosed and controlled by her enemies. Take Leningrad, or as it is now known, St. Petersburg. Lovely port, but any warships there can only sail around the Baltic Sea. If they wish to venture further and reach the Atlantic, they must pass through the Kattegat, which is the strait between Denmark and Sweden. This is tricky to navigate and, of course, guarded by NATO. It is, in fact, a choke point, which in time of war could easily be mined and used as a place to attack ships from the land. Russia's Baltic fleet can only sail the high seas if NATO are in the mood to let them. The port of Vladivostok is in a similar case, with access only to the Sea of Japan. There are choke points at either end of Japan, which means that it would be easy to stop Russian ships from entering the Pacific. I wonder if viewers are getting the picture now. We come now to the best of Russia's warm water ports, which is Sevastopol. It was to secure this port for all time that Russia seized the Crimea in 2014. The problem with Sevastopol is that it only allows ships to move around the Black Sea. If they wish to get into the Atlantic and so on, then they must pass firstly through Istanbul and then the Straits of the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara and so on. This will allow them to reach the Mediterranean. And then there is another choke point at Gibraltar. This, by the way, is one reason that we have always been so keen to hang on to Gibraltar. In the 19th century, Russia, as the great land power, posed a threat to the British in India because, of course, they only needed to hop into Afghanistan and then they were right next door to India, on our imperial doorstep, as you might put it. This was a threat we could do little about, but when the arguments flared up about access to the holy sites in Jerusalem in the early 1850s, it gave us a good excuse to show the Russians that they needn't think that they would be able to menace our shipping by having pretensions to being a sea power as well, which of course led to the Crimean War. In the First World War, Russia were our allies, but access to the country via the Straits of the Dardanelles and the choke point of Istanbul was still of great significance, which is why we landed at Gallipoli, to secure those straits. By all of which it will be seen that British interest in Russia's access to the high seas has been a constant theme for hundreds of years. It's sometimes asked why an Asian Muslim nation like Turkey, which is nowhere near the North Atlantic, should nevertheless be a member of NATO. And this is the reason, because that choke point of Istanbul and the Dardanelles is still as important as ever. When the Russians withdraw from their Syrian base at Latakia, how else will they be able to get their ships back to Sevastopol, other than by taking them through the Dardanelles? This then is the real reason for our involvement and interest in Ukraine. It has nothing whatsoever to do with sticking up for a nation being bullied by Russia, and everything to do with the same geopolitical realities which have shaped our policy in that part of the world since Queen Victoria was on the throne.